Good afternoon, colleagues. We are just waiting a few moments before we start. I see the number of participants climbing. This is fantastic. We'll start in just a few moments. Okay, I think we will go ahead and make a start. So, Ramelwia de Mamabuti, and good afternoon to you, everyone. Great afternoon to all of you from wherever around the world that you're joining us. We are very pleased that you've decided to join what will hopefully be a very exciting session on where next for loss and damage, dealing with the risks beyond adaptation. My name is Christopher Bartlett. I'm a board member of the Pacific Island Climate Action Network based here in Vanuatu. And I've been working on climate action for more than 21 years now. Before commencing, I would like to acknowledge the people of Ifira, on whose land we are hosting the Vanuatu hub of this climate summit. And I'm joined by a fantastic crowd from Vanuatu. I have great pleasure in moderating the session, and I welcome you all and look forward to your comments and questions. Please feel free to use the chat at will. So the Pacific Climate Justice Summit is bringing together a wide range of key actors from national governments, from civil society, faith communities, development partners, and communities, with the primary objective of solidifying strong human rights and climate justice policy positions in the lead up to COP26. The summit is an opportunity to enhance our understanding on intersectional climate justice, and today has already provided an incredible platform for exchange of knowledge and experience. So thanks so much to the speakers and the sessions that have gone this morning. While every individual in the Pacific has firsthand experience of climate loss and damage, it is also a critical technical issue within the UNFCCC climate change negotiations. And while there is no formal definition of loss and damage is generally understood to be harm to natural and human systems that cannot be avoided through mitigation or adaptation. So beyond adaptation, or unfortunately, as often is the case in the Pacific, is harm that results when predictable, accessible finance, action, and support is underprovided by those governments and businesses who are most responsible for this climate emergency. The name of the summit very much reflects the fact that Pacific civil society strongly demands climate justice in the face of this loss and damage that stems from cyclones, extreme weather, slow onset events like sea level rise and ocean acidification, but also includes non-economic losses and displacement due to the adverse impacts of climate change. Sadly, in the lead up to COP26, there are still many parties, even within the Pacific family, that refuse to acknowledge the urgency of immediately phasing out fossil fuels, which is in turn fueling more destruction, more damage, more devastation, and loss of life on our Pacific shores and in our seas. So I would like to now bring in our distinguished panelists to reflect on how COP26 can catalyze a seismic shift and a reconfiguration in the way that we think about loss and damage. Today, we have here Viliamu Yese from the University of the South Pacific. We have Makareta Wangavonovono from the Social Employment and Education Program, as well as the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. We have Vasiti Soko from Fiji's National Disaster Management Office, Sabira Coelho from the International Organization for Migration, as well as Chanel Iroy from Solomon Islands Ministry of Environment, Climate Change, Disaster Management, and Meteorology. So to all the panelists, I will ask you general questions. First, I'd like to hear a real example of how you have experienced in your personal life loss and damage, but also your views, this would be the second question, on compensation for those suffering climate loss and damage here in the Pacific, compensation within the UNFCCC, but also outside of the convention. And finally, if you could give us all one key loss and damage call to action or a priority that you would like to see our Pacific delegations champion in the lead up to or at COP26. So I now have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Viliamo Yese, who is a research fellow at the University of the South Pacific and an expert on loss and damage caused by climate change. Vili, the floor is yours.
Bula and Talo Falava, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Okay, I can see the interpreter. She is interpreting now, so that's good. I think that is okay. Yes, thanks very much, Dr. Chris. I'm not speaking here today as a person who went to the COPs or the UNFCCC level. I am speaking here today as a person who grew up in the Pacific and also as a researcher and a teacher. I'm a teacher here at the University of South Pacific. There are quite a lot of information to cover based on the questions, but I'll try my very best. First, I just want to put a bit of context into the discussion. So I just want to quickly acknowledge the organizers for the opportunity. I also want to acknowledge the Pacific Island countries, leaders, and all negotiators and organizations who have supported the loss and damage agenda in the UNFCCC. It's not an easy fight, but especially to the countries like Vanuatu, who initiated it all the way back in the early 90s, Tuvalu, Nauru, Fiji, Solomons, and all the alliance of the Solomon Island, Solomon Islands states, small island states, the AOCs. There is also a working group in the Pacific looking at loss and damage, and I think SPREP is leading a lot of activities on the loss and damage from the regional perspective. So it has been a long fight, but loss and damage made it in the Paris Agreement as Article 8, where parties recognize the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. So kudos and congratulations to all of you who made it happen. But when I saw this the first time, I thought this is toothless shot. So it's very strong wording. Well, it's only recognized, but with no financial ties to it, or we can talk about that later. As Dr. Chris mentioned, there is no agreed upon definition of loss and damage, but there is a working definition that loss and damage represent the actual and or potential manifestation of impacts associated with current climate and future climate change that negatively affect human and natural systems. Also, loss and damage can be economic. For example, the loss of your house or the crops or infrastructure, or non-economic, like the loss of ecosystem services, biodiversity, culture, and my identity. Who says that's non-economic? That is very economic to me. There are different variations when I speak about loss and damage with a capital L and a capital D. I'm referring to the negotiations at the UNFCCC and at the political level. And when I talk about the small letter L and the small letter D, it means the loss and damage experienced at the local level. And often there's also a damage and losses, which is a reverse, which is mainly to the disaster risk management community. And those are the damage and losses after disasters. To answer the first question, I, like any other Pacific person growing up and living in the Pacific Islands, have experienced losses and damage to climate change. This is very clear. Loss and damage is not just happening now or will happen in the future. Our Pacific Island people have been suffering and coping and trying to adapt and addressing climate change loss and damage for the last 30 years and continuing on. And the losses are getting worse every year. And the projections are even more worse as well. I am not going to go into details of what I personally experienced, but I want to share some findings of the research that was conducted by the University of South Pacific in partnership with UNESCO back in 2016, trying to assess community-based loss and damage in the agriculture and the tourism sectors in the Cook Islands, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Samoa, and Timor-Leste. But I'm also including here some other losses and damages experienced by some of the other countries. But when we talk about the losses and damages due to climate change, it's important to categorize them into the losses incurred by extreme events and also the slow onsets, because often sometimes we get bundle them all of them together as impacts of cyclones. For example, of some losses due to the extreme events, it's very clear the impacts of TCPAM in Vanuatu, about $56.5 million US. Waves from the same cyclone went and hit Tuvalu, destroyed about 30 to 90% of the crops on some of the islands, dug up the dead body from the graves, and caused a loss of about 25% of Tuvalu's GDP. Not from the cyclone, but by the waves that were generated by the cyclone. TC Winston, about $1 billion in Fiji, Fijian dollars. Kita, $43 million US in Tonga. And the damages to the tourism sector are also very severe, but not well assessed and addressed, because there is a general assumption that it's up to the private sector to deal with it. But there have been some good initiatives in Vanuatu, Samoa, Fiji, to include the private sector in this post-disaster assessment and recovery, and also to provide some recovery package for the tourism sector. But they are too small to help the sector recover. Flooding, there's a very well-known case of loss in in Honiara, 2014, about 9,000 households destroyed, more than 75% of food gardens, total loss of around $18 million US for the agriculture sector. Droughts in Tonga, this is the famous one, 2015, 2016, during the El Nino droughts, dried about 75% of wells in Tongoa and Shepherd Islands in Vanuatu. Drought followed the TCPAM. This is an interesting one because we've just published a paper in May that looks at the cascading events of these losses. There was a drought before TCPAM, and then it got broken by TCPAM rainfall. And after TCPAM, the drought continued on. And then it also happened in Fiji when Winston happened in 2016. And this is like we're always in a recovery mode from these losses because one after the other. The drought and frost in Papua New Guinea, the same drought affected about 700,000 people. And the same time in the Northern Pacific, hit about 81% of the population in RMI, the Republic of the Micronesia, affected the access to water. So there are a lot of those extreme events examples there. The slow onsets, we have a very interesting case from Serua in Fiji, where the shifted of rainfall changed the flowering and fruiting of mandarin and then drua or Fiji asparagus in Serua, according to the communities there. And then it changed the sources of income for the households at those particular villages. It shifted the sources of livelihoods from depending on mandarin, oranges to and Fiji asparagus to more of a hunting lifestyle, and because of the heavy rainfalls at those sites now. The sea level, that is very clear. We have research outcomes from some of the people that assessment conducted in 2009, wells in the outer islands in Chuuk State in FSM. Most cases that there were high salinity in the water since 1984. Kiribati, if the rise of sea level by 0.4 meters would shrink the water lens by 30%. And there's also impact on ground reserve in Samoa because of the rise of sea level and a lot of abandonment of some of those boreholes. So there are a lot of these stories, but there are some important factors that came out of there. We know about these losses and damage because there are established methods like the post-disaster needs assessment methodologies. I know the TRM experts in this panel might talk about. We also know about them from the research we carry out here at the University of South Pacific, but they are not enough. There's still a lot more work to be done. There are established methods for assessing damage and losses after extreme events, cyclones, for example, and all existing mechanisms, including insurance and all these things, are all aligned to these extreme events methodologies. But we do not have methods and proper assessments and mechanisms to address slow onset events. So that is something that we need to look at. There has been, there's a very good training manual developed by the global GIZ research looking at addressing loss and damage. And they have done a lot of trainings for governments, NGOs, regional organizations all around the world. We also have this in Fiji. I think we did this last year to some extent here in Fiji. So there are not sufficient methods and resources and mechanisms to assess and monitor the losses against slow onset events. For example, the sea level rise, increase in temperature, ocean acidification. And we might know the rate of change, but we need to know the rate of change and the impacts on the people, infrastructure, ecosystem, services, and culture, and so forth. But one thing we're very sure of is that the impacts of slow onsets are very severe. And our Pacific Island communities will not be able to recover from. And we can recover after extreme events, but we cannot recover after slow onset events. Once a land is eroding or claimed by the sea, it is gone forever. So how can we build back? That's where there is nothing to build back from or to. So that is very important for us to look at, especially with the slow onset events. The implications of loss and damage from the slow onset events are severe. Another important point that came out of the research was that about 90% of the adaptations that were done to avert, minimize, and address losses and damage in the agriculture and tourism sector were not effective in averting or stopping the losses. Some were effective in minimizing the losses, and very little were effective in addressing the losses. But I think we need impact evaluation research, especially looking at effectiveness of adaptations and risk reduction actions in our Pacific Islands. There is a mention of loss and damage in Paris Agreement, but there are no financial or resourcing mechanisms to avert, minimize, and address L&D. Because of the lack of investments in averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, we're only talking a lot about loss and damage. So this is a lot of talk. To answer the second question on how can permanent loss and irreversible damage best be acknowledged? I think based on what I mentioned, I think there are two just basic quick way. As a researcher and a teacher, it is important to build the capacity of Pacific Island people to recognize, quantify, qualify, and assess the loss and damages due to the climate change at all levels, whether it's through participatory means or hard sciences, mixing traditional knowledge and science as well here, like a mark on the coconut tree where the sea level is, or any other participatory approach. And we need to educate our Pacific Island people and equip them with the resources to recognize and acknowledge. We should never stop talking about it. We should never stop writing about it, and never stop providing the evidence of loss and damage at all levels. So here in the University of South Pacific, we have a postgraduate diploma program in climate change, which including teaching and research on loss and damage. And many of the graduates that came out of our program are now leaders at the negotiation tables in the UNFCCC, also leading governments, NGOs, and are also involving in regional organizations. And most importantly, the leaders of their families and their communities. So, so first we need to document the small letter loss and damage to provide the evidence and the information that our policymakers and our negotiators and leaders need to take to the regional international meetings to talk about the capital L&D. And the second one, we need to continue the dialogue on loss and damage, especially the need to create funding mechanisms to action the Article 8, because we really need that. And we need to shift from the narrative, from just talking about climate change impacts, to actually talk about climate change, loss and damage. There's oftentimes we talk about impacts, it's just a general sense of it, but we need to go deeper, go to the next level of it, talk about the narrative of loss and damage, because climate change impacts is, to me, it's getting really common and it's very shallow. And we need to go beyond the impacts, not just to talk about the loss of a crop yield or coastal erosion or lack of access to water during the climatic event, but go beyond on loss of food security, loss of land security, loss of human dignity, loss of human rights, and loss of our national sovereignty. So to the final point, I think for the COP26, we just need more resources and more investment on averting and reducing risk, not just addressing, but to all the three components there for loss and damage. And loss and damage to climate change are mostly irreversible. When it gets to the slow onset and continue rising on sea level, it's getting much, much more worse to address or come back from. And I think that is loss and damage due to climate change is a national and regional security issue. Therefore, we need the financing mechanisms to enable Pacific Island countries who did not cause climate change to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage for now and all our future generations. So I think that's what I could say now, but I'm happy to answer later on. Vinaka.
Vinaka, Vili, it's always a great pleasure to hear you speak, and thank you so much for those reflections. I think you're absolutely right. Every single Pacific Island person has experienced loss and damage. You gave some pretty horrifying statistics, economic statistics, but also non-economic losses and damage that we've experienced. You brought up the fact that we have been talking about loss and damage since the 1990s, and it's only just made it into the Paris Agreement in 2015, but only recognized and not financed. You brought up the need to assess loss and damage and use established methodologies, but yet we have a challenge with actually assessing non-economic losses and monitoring slow onset damage and loss. You brought up the fact that adaptation is very rarely effective and that this is a key determinant of loss and damage. And thank you so much for bringing up solutions, particularly around capacity. Not just capacity of Western science, but the capacity of traditional knowledge science, and that we should never stop talking, never stop writing, and never stop providing evidence on loss and damage in the Pacific. I thank you so much for that, Billy. I now have the pleasure of introducing our second speaker. Our second speaker is Makareta Wangabonobono. Makareta is a lawyer who has practiced in Australia, Fiji, and the Solomon Islands. She has been working as a law and development consultant since 2014 in Fiji, with a particular focus on climate justice and human rights. She's working in partnership with the Suva-based Social Employment and Education Program and on a climate displacement and relocation project in 8 climate vulnerable communities in Fiji. So Makareta, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chris. Bula Vinaka, and good afternoon to all tuning in to this session. I also wish to thank the organizers for my late addition in this session. My comments will focus on climate displacement and relocation, and I'm glad that our first speaker gave that framework from which I can come in. I'll be speaking from community perspectives on L&D experiences on the ground here in Fiji. In particular, some findings on a convening with leaders and representatives from 9 vulnerable communities in Fiji, some of whom had come from communities that had been relocated. Now, on the background, forced displacement is not a new phenomenon for Fiji. Our ancestors, like other Pacific Islanders, have historically been resilient people and have moved. And these movements were triggered by tribal warfare, diseases, outbreak, drought, famine, colonial and evangelical influences. But climate-forced displacement, which is now a reality for us in small island developing states in the Pacific, is affecting our livelihood, development, and health. And in some cases, our very existence as small island states in the front line. And we're experiencing the worst of climate change impacts, despite having the smallest carbon footprint in the world. So climate displacement describes this process in the movement of people from their homes, either within or beyond their national boundaries. due to displacement from climate. In Fiji, we are fortunate that it's possible to integrate internally displaced person and have in some cases been able to relocate communities, a process which is not so easy in smaller island atoll states. But the process comes at great financial, social, and economic costs. I will only be referring to displacement within national borders, on communities living under traditional customary law arrangements and not informal settlements in Fiji. The challenges beyond national boundaries are sensitive matters and really for consideration by those affected in SIDS. In Fiji, as I mentioned, it is a reality now for the vulnerable coastal communities who face either slow onset climate impacts, such as sea level rise or disaster caused by frequent and extreme weather events, such as tropical cyclones and flooding. The forced displacement of communities are often people that can least afford to move, and relocation occurs as a result of a loss of ability to live on their ancestral land, which impacts on their cultural identity through loss of traditional and sacred sites and knowledge and practices associated with these. These kinds of losses are both economic and non-economic and impact on our enjoyment by the affected communities of a range of human rights, including our rights to life, health, food, water, clean and healthy environment, and adequate standards of living to cite a few. Briefly, non-economic loss is a loss of things that are not normally bought or sold, very difficult to value, and include life, human health, territory, indigenous knowledge, and the likes. So most of us are aware of what's happening in our coastal villages here in Fiji. Over the years, the climate experiences have led to partial submersion of beaches, loss of land, water sources, and seeping in of salinated water into our arable land. This has caused, has affected our fresh drinking water, coastal vegetation. So in Fiji, as far back as 2012, a community integrated assessment, or SIVA, was proposed to be conducted to assess these vulnerable communities. And in the lead up to the COP23 in Bonn, the village communities in Serua, Namosi, the Kondravenbua, Maduata were assessed. And following this assessment, the Fiji government announced that there were 830 communities that were vulnerable to climate impacts in Fiji. 60 of these communities are agreeable to and require urgent relocation. The Minister Seru Ratu later announced in Parliament in 2018 that some 48 communities have been prioritized for relocation. So that's the general situation we are looking at in Fiji. There have been 3 villages who have been fully relocated in the Kondrove, one in Ba, and in Bua. These relocations were full relocation, and in Wunisabsavi, in the Kondrove, and recently in Narikosa in Kandavu, in last year, were partial relocations, where only households that were directly affected were moved to higher ground. Now, Fiji is the first country in the world to come up with relocation and displacement guidelines. And these are, I'm told, complying the lessons learned from earlier relocations by the government ministries and for climate disasters, and on a more particularized operating procedures. I believe that these were released last year. I've yet to see this. So Fiji stands in the forefront of climate relocation in the world. And by the same token, we want to ensure that what is happening in in the national and global level is also communicated to those affected in these communities, and the decisions that they are fully consulted made on their behalf. This is not always the case here in Fiji, and therefore it leaves spaces for CSOs like those that I'm engaged with to ensure that information is sought, is consulted, and that communities who are going to be affected are consulted. So the project that I have been involved in led to a convening of 17 leaders and members of the vulnerable communities, 8 of the vulnerable communities that we work with, and to discuss the experiences on climate impacts and also on the displacement issues they face. For ease of the discussions, we held these in the vernacular, and the participants were very enthusiastic. It was the first time that they said they have been involved, that they have been able to share the experiences, you know, with people who are going through the same problems and the same, the same issues that they face. We were also able to create awareness on the guidelines that the government has come up with, and also to get them to provide their views so that these could be filtered into the procedures that the government was doing. I felt that this was a very important and groundbreaking for those of us who've been working in the climate area, especially since previously I'd been involved in climate litigation work. And for that, I find that we really, it's kind of like 2 steps forward and 4 steps back. So it was very useful to be working with people who were appreciative of what was happening. So the challenges noted from these consultations were that the main thing was that funding, of course. This will always be the shortfall that these communities will face. In some cases, although relocation had occurred, the shortfall in funding meant that they could complete what was intended or was planned to have happened. So, so in some of the communities, you would see, dried bags of cement. And these were like, some of the concern that, that these communities felt that should not be happening. It was fortunate that, land is accessible for our dislocated communities. And although recent experience has shown that this may not always be the case because of conflicting expectations between host communities and guest communities who need to be acknowledged when they see that those who come in as guests are now living in better homes, have a better livelihood and surroundings. So issues have been dealt with in that corresponding homes have been fixed up so that they reach the same level of or the same standard. Land issues was a big, it was a gripping subject that we had to draw away from, and it's unfinished business that we still have to go back to. As a lawyer, I hadn't realized how native laws are very, very complicated. So it's important for relocating communities who do not own the land that they're moving into to have some formal arrangement so that they can have security in the land that they live in. And that will avoid conflicts post-relocation. Of course, compensation and restitution for the losses sustained by these communities is always going to be a major challenge and a controversial subject. In particular, the subject of non-economic losses. This is a subject that is often deliberately ignored because it's quite a complex area. Monitoring and evaluation, this was something that they felt should be ongoing and should not come to a full stop once relocation had occurred or losses had been assessed. Now, the need for effective consultation was stressed and kept coming again and again. And this was to do with the fact that most of the people that we dealt with were not aware of the guidelines that had been made on their behalf, and that they felt that they should be sitting on in the table when these things are discussed, because it's their lives that are being affected. And so this is something that we have highlighted. We were not very popular in highlighting these because, of course, agencies who are involved don't like to be criticized. But I would hope that this was a positive criticism, that really you need to consult with the communities who are involved. And one of the things that really came out was assessing both economic and non-economic losses. In the latter case of non-economic losses, ways of, because it's very difficult to assess, there's a need, the need was felt to map the tangible and intangible losses, which are regarded as vital. These, for tangible losses like land, housing, infrastructure, they're quite easy to put a value to, not so with your customary heritage, your traditional knowledge, and this can be a complex process. But these processes have been allowed in other situations. There are other cases which I won't dwell on, but what kept coming up, apart from consultation, were communication sources that these community reps were very, very clear on how they saw existing systems being utilized within their village communication structures. So it was interesting to note that while most seemed to feel that relocation was a given, there were actually two communities that didn't feel that they wanted to be resettled or relocated elsewhere. And we acknowledge that it is the right of these communities to continue the measures of adaptation that they've practiced. And consultation with these communities with communities affected must be a priority, acknowledging that free, prior, and informed consent is paramount. So we come to the questions.
So Margareta, just a quick break here. We're short on time, yes. So if you could wrap up with the questions, thanks.
Yes. So the first question is, do I have any personal experience? Yes, of course. I think with all of us who live in Fiji have experienced all these cyclones that we've come across, and flooding. Those are the two key areas, two key experiences that I would say that most of us have experienced. The stories that I have related cover the second part of the questions. There are many stories to be told, and in the evenings, these were some of the stories that we sat around in our exchanges, many of the lessons learned by these community leaders. So the second question, how can permanent loss and irreversible damage best be acknowledged and compensated for through negotiation? Well, funding is the key source there. But by the same token, I think both you, Chris, and our first speaker mentioned the fact that loss and damage has been around for a long time without much progress being made on funding. And so, I reiterate that although I'm I came in as a late observer, but I saw this in action in the COP23 in Bonn, and I'm very interested to see, how you could, you couldn't get anywhere. We went in with very high hopes, and I was able to go into the room where state discussions being held, because I was observer with the Solomon Island delegation, and it was a very interesting experience that I will never forget. So funding, funding is something that you know that it's going to be something that there will always be obstacle, but that doesn't mean that one should stop putting pressure. In particular, when we now see what is happening in our frontline communities, how our people are suffering, how people can walk through puddle water 1 feet deep when their village green is flooded by seawater, how their food is affected, how their marine resources get affected. So there's a need to keep pressure on that. And so I think the last question was the call to action. Of course, given the project and my intimate involvement with the climate displaced communities in Fiji, that would be an area that I'd say that funding should be, there should be a dedicated funding for that. And I'd say that linked to that would be the non-economic loss question, and the adoption of new approaches that could get us deeper into the question. And one way of kickstarting this is to put monetary figure on the non-economic loss that people say they will be forfeiting. And this is, although this is a very controversial areas, because the nature of those losses is still to be decided. The value, who will give the value, and can any cost compensate for a moral wrong? Those are the questions that we've got to deal with. And finally, that I think it is very important for communities to keep a record of the losses and in their communities, to map. This is not an impossible task, and it doesn't have to be very complicated to keep an inventory of what you see happening in your communities. I think a project known as the Rauti Para project in the Cook Islands involved, tablets that were distributed to seniors in the community for the purpose of keeping an inventory of what is being lost. So you can value the losses. It is not impossible. Thank you, Chris.
Margareta, thank you so much. I mean, just a wealth of information you've given us, and some very profound ideas, particularly about mapping this intangible loss, non-economic losses that we're experiencing, putting a figure on it, a value on it. And thank you so much for the call to not stop putting pressure for financing. The UNFCCC negotiations are incredibly slow and frustrating, but we cannot afford to stop this pressure. So Margareta, thank you so much for that contribution. We are now going to move to our third speaker. I have the pleasure to introduce Vasiti Soko, who is the director of Fiji's National Disaster Management Office. Vasiti, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chris. Mulavanaka to each and every one of you. It's nice to be invited in this forum. I won't repeat most of the things that the two earlier speakers have alluded to. However, I'll speak specifically on the damage and loss in the disaster space. For information purposes, for the youth, the Pacific Island states are rated high in the World Risk Index for natural hazards. As a range of dangerous phenomena intensifies due to global warming, countries are set to assess how this impact, or what we call damage and loss, will be accounted for. For Fiji, for the past cyclone season, not only did we experience a Category 5 cyclone, we experienced another Category cyclone, and also what would have been a Category 1 cyclone in addition to rain, lots and lots of rain. So different disaster brings different costs that's accompanied to it. And the Fijian DMO, in an event aftermath of a disaster, either conducts a post-disaster need assessment, a PDNA, or we conduct what we call a grade. So for TCASA, through the support of the World Bank, we conducted grade. And this is some of the assessment tools that are used to estimate the cost of damage. Further to that, I would also like to allude or share the same sentiment that was shared by the earlier speaker. While we are in this dilemma where we're trying to ascertain where we stand in terms of damage and loss, the Pacific efforts to address loss and damage are hindered by lack of data, and Fiji is of no difference. Lack of data to understand, monitor, and evaluate the crisis that we face. This is something that we've learned from, and we are working to improve on. And I'm happy to say that the previous two cyclones, the Fijian DMO, have moved away from manual initial damage assessment and detailed damage assessment to a digitalized form of both IDA and DDA. And this has enabled us to expedite the process of capturing damage that incurs not only by the cyclone, but also the flood in the last cyclone season. As we all know, when there is a disaster, there are consequences. So a few I will make mention now. Gender dimension of disaster and climate change adaptation. The loss of livelihoods and impacts of food security in agriculture and fisheries from climate-related disasters are significant. Usually aftermath of a disaster, this case is very serious. And they have different types of impacts on those living below poverty line, and different types of impact of women and men due to gender division of labor, and women predominant in the informal settlement. This is common in the agriculture sector, where women labor is often unpaid or low paid. Family labor, especially when women do not own or have entitlement to land. And so some of the losses, I believe was mentioned by our earlier speaker, was related to this, the fact that the non-measurement loss that needs to be accounted for us comes in the form of gender dimension of disaster and climate change adaptation. We're working with our partners to ensure that we capture this and we measure it. In terms of exposure, our earlier speaker did elaborate a lot on relocation. The NDMO Fiji has done the 6 partial relocation that Mrs. Wangavonovono did mention, the recent one being Narikoso. Lesson learned from Narikoso relocation was the improvement of buildings. We have adopted a Category 5 building design to ensure that it's able to withstand Category 5 cycle. Further to that, we not only looked at the structure of the home, we looked at the livelihood, we looked at how we can ensure that business runs as usual, how they can ensure that there's food security available. So there were a lot of provisions and a lot of thinking that went behind the relocation of Narikoso in this case. The project did take a bit longer due to the changes in environment as well as the cyclones and the disaster period. However, we've managed to relocate the 6 homes that were directly impacted by sea level rise. And the lesson learned from there are now being factored in the relocation guideline as well as the SOP that's currently being developed under the leadership of Ministry of Economy. What are a few things that the National Disaster Management Office is doing in the space of damage and loss? I'd like to make mention that we, over the years, have worked on strengthening governance arrangement to disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation. Fiji has already adopted a broad-based risk management approach, including both standard and transformative DRR and CCA actions, including, we're currently reviewing our disaster legislation. We are working on localization, strengthening capacity to prepare and respond to disasters at subnational level, system of disaster risk management communities at subnational level. The emergency structure in Fiji has proven to have its strength because of the relationship that we have right down to the community at the national and as well as the national level. And so communication is easy in the space of disaster when it comes to activating the Fiji emergency disaster structure. So localization for us is very important. We work very closely with our partners to ensure we mainstream that at the subnational level. We're also, through our executive membership to the Coalition of Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, we have also taken initiative to form Fiji's technical working group on resilient infrastructure. And what's important here is the inclusive of the private sector. So the NDMO not only works along with government entities, but we also bring in the private sector to also discuss resilient infrastructure moving forward so that we embrace the term resilient infrastructure. Formation of the technical working group for border agencies. This is something that's fairly new. We work very closely with our border agencies to strengthen border facilitation of international humanitarian assistance. This is an ongoing work. Started last year, however, it was paused due to the arrival of TCASA, and we hope to continue this further after we tone down a bit on our current COVID-19 response. We are currently developing our risk resilient profiles with climate change projections. We are also working on a community-based disaster risk management policy. So we've got the policy that has now a concept paper developed under the policy. We have two separate documents that we are currently working on. One is the disaster volunteer manual, and the second one is the community-based disaster training manual. So we are trying to ensure that our disaster volunteers are trained, as well as the communities are trained on the same concept. In an event of disaster, we are able to speak on the same tone. So critical for us, while we work towards the policy, the hands and the arms on the ground needs to sync. And therefore, this is one of the two main documents that Fiji is currently developing, and we hope to complete this before the start of this, the upcoming cyclone season. And also in December 2018, Fiji launched its National Disaster Risk Reduction Policy. Under that, we have 122 action activity, which is cross-sectorial. This again, including the private sector and how we can improve not only building resilience, but also ensure that there's a voice to everybody. Under this National Disaster Risk Reduction Policy, we have the evacuation center guideline, which is something that we are also developing, and it's all coming out of a policy. Again, I can't reiterate enough the effort of the Fijian government when it comes to disaster risk reduction and promoting governance around that. The other thing that I also would like to mention is the Fiji government through the NDMO is committed to the people of Fiji to strengthen risk-informed development and solidifying our overall integrated approach and coordination mechanism, making sure that our linkages and cooperation from communities to government are strong. Like I said, the existence of Fiji's emergency structure allows this relationship to work. Finally, I believe the question is what message would you like to take forward? For Fiji NDMO, given the current work and the promotion on governance, there are two key messages that we would like to put forward. One is switching to renewable. Again, for us in the Pacific, this is difficult because of the geographical locations of our islands. You know, for us in Fiji, there's 300 uninhabited islands. How are we going to ensure that there's renewable energy? And this is where the formation of governance around the establishment of key people, forming a technical working group to talk about how we can ensure that our islanders or our remote islands have access to renewable energy. So Fiji is currently working or ensuring moving forward that the term renewable energy is contextualized. We're working with the Department of Energy. We have a few projects under CDRI. One of it is around renewable energy and how we can leverage those that are in the community to adopt the concept of renewable energy. And as we all know, for us here in Fiji, it's the most reliable source of energy at the community level is solar lights and solar panels. And this is something we will also try to advocate. Similarly, like the relocation I had mentioned earlier in Narikoso, we installed solar light. We did not do a hybrid generator or anything of that sort. Solar lights was installed at each individual home to ensure that we promote the term renewable energy. Last but not the very least, I think this has again been alluded by the two speakers, the power of traditional knowledge, I can't stress that enough. The age-old practice of indigenous communities combined with latest scientific innovations are being increasingly seen as an important way to adapt to the changes brought about climate crisis and mitigate its impact. A few examples that we have not only here in Fiji, but across the Pacific: mangrove forests are being restored on islands. This is to ensure that communities are protected. Seafaring vessels through the island of Micronesia and Melanesia in the Pacific, using solar panels and batteries instead of internal combustion. A foundation is building traditional Polynesian canoes, serving a sustainable passage and cargo transport for health services, education, disaster relief, and research. So those are a few things that, moving forward, the Fiji NDMO would like to advocate, not only switching to renewable energy, but also taking into account traditional knowledge that have existed over the years, documenting it and ensure that it's part of the implementation process. Last but not the very least, I'd just like to end with, as youth, as future leaders, you will shape the way disasters and climate change adaptation is run in our region. So please start looking at the gaps and suggest solutions to our leaders. Those little things can add up to make a difference.
Thank you so much, Basiti. That was very comprehensive, wonderful presentation for the case studies you've given from Fiji. I think Fiji stands out as a leader, a global leader. Thank you for highlighting the policies, the guidelines, the 6th relocation. Congratulations on that. And the fact that you're really localizing broad-based risk management, which has a subnational focus, including climate and disaster. Thank you also for the information on the PDNA exercises and the fact that we still have a lack of data to really understand and monitor this crisis. I think the NDMO is doing a fantastic job, particularly with the digitalization that you're working on. Thank you also for mentioning this intersectionality in loss and damage. You highlighted the gender dimensions, food security, those living in poverty, those living in informal settlements. It is not a homogeneous issue that we're focusing on here. And your calls to action for the youth, I think that resonates with a lot of people in this room, and particularly the participants here. Really, the youth are going to shape the future. So very, very much thank you for that. And I am very glad to call on our next speaker now, who is Chanel Iroy, who is the Under Secretary Technical at the Solomon Islands Ministry of Environment, Climate Change, Disaster Management, and Meteorology. Chanel is passionate about climate change and particularly permanent loss and irreversible damage that is being caused to the Pacific Islands by climate change. Chanel, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to for the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion this afternoon. Like the other speakers, basically I will also contribute to the discussion on loss and damage as a government official and as a negotiator who attended some of the previous COPs in the past. Just a bit of background on, as we all know, what LND, loss and damage is as a layman's term, is what happens when the coping mechanisms for adaptation and mitigation no longer holds. So that's my understanding of loss and damage. When we're taking actions on adaptation and mitigation, and when it fails, when all the interventions fails, what will happen? So that's the idea on loss and damage. It's the impacts that could not be reversed when adaptation and mitigation fails. The idea on loss and damage, it started well back in 1991 when the Small Island Development States, AOSIS, looking at the idea on how can the countries be compensated for the damage caused by sea level rise. So it's the idea that initiated well back in 1991. And that concept continued to grow when other countries become part of the discussion, they too say that, oh, we'll be in the same boat as the small island developing states. We too in the same boat because we cannot cope when some of the interventions that we took no longer holds. So the concept continued to grow and grow and gain support throughout the years until this concept becomes a COP decision. And that work, and it became a loss and damage work program. It was initiated in COP16 and became a COP decision way back in COP19 in Warsaw in Poland, which we all know is the Warsaw Implementation Mechanism WIM. That's the COP decision that gives that holds this idea on what the parties needs to do to address this issue on loss and damage. And in the Paris Agreement, there you have the Article 8, which also addresses this issue on loss and damage. So it's gained momentum now. So it becomes one of the principal articles in the Paris Agreement at Article 8, so that you know that this issue on loss and damage has been addressed at the international forum at the COP conference of the parties. So now we know loss and damage now has become one of the thematic pillars of the UNFCCC, like the adaptation and mitigation. So for island developing countries, AOCs, and also least developed countries who are very vulnerable to the issues and to the impacts of climate change, we need to address all these three issues on adaptation. We also need to address the issue of mitigation too, even though all the emissions that we came out from our countries are very, very small. But we need to take the initiative to continue to show to the world that we can do little things in terms of mitigation to show the world that even though we are not responsible, we need to play our part, the moral part in addressing this issue of climate change. But moreover, we have to deal with the issue on loss and damage. As Dr. William has mentioned, it will be here with us. We know that going to the effects on climate change will continue to go on, even if we stop climate change, but the effects, the impacts will continue to go on for centuries. So we need to deal with the issue on loss and damage, not on the ground, but also we need to address in the international forum so that the bigger countries, those who have the resources, those who have the capacity to help countries like the small island developing states, but also the LDCs as well. So in terms of looking at what can we do now, we understand that in the Madrid COP, the COP recently held in COP25, which was held in Madrid about 2 years ago, they've set up what we call the Santiago Network. We all know that this is one of the avenues that is currently being discussed towards the COP in Glasgow as well, to look at moving this issue on the Santiago Network in terms of using this network to address this issue on loss and damage. And we're hoping that that will continue discussions, maybe 2 more COPs to a decision that will establish this network in place to address this issue on loss and damage. So it's currently been discussed. We have been during some of the technical discussions during this year, The COP president is taking the initiative to discuss this network with, it's basically, it will involve a wide range of stakeholders. You have the academia, you have the community organization, you have the experts, you have the private sector, you have the government, those who will be participating and involving, that will contribute into this network, the Santiago network. It will address the issues on what happens to the impacts on slow events, but also the impacts on the climate change as well. So let me also give you some of my personal experience in terms of the questions Chris that you put across for us. In terms of the experiences, well, Dr. William has mentioned one of the experiences that we've gone through back in 2014, Solomon Islands. It was one of the worst floods that affected the country. It's affected the economic sector of the country. So it's really one of the, it's not a normal case, but it's an unusual case because something that's affected the country is quite unusual. So those one of the, and it's impacted the economic sector of the country. We have also in the countries that islands have lost. One of the studies that's conducted by the University of Queensland, 5 islands have lost in the past of storms. We have also villages being lost but in the country due to severe storm and due to high level winds and also storm surges. So those are some of the impacts of extreme weather and also civil rights that's affected by climate change in the country. In terms of looking at how can LND be acknowledged and also compensated through the negotiations at COP26? Well, as we all know, the negotiations are involved with parties. So any decisions that has to be taken has to be agreed by all parties. So now that the loss and damage has been acknowledged in the international fora, in the negotiations, in the conference of parties, we will continue to advocate for this issue because it's like one of the thematic pillars of the UNFCCC, and we'll continue to work with our partners. We all know the AOCs and the LDCs are one of the largest negotiating groups in the negotiations. So we'll continue to advocate working with each other to ensure that this issue on loss and damage continue to be on the table and continue to be we continue to advocate for ensuring that we have a decision that will hopefully come this year here in the Glasgow COP, because we want to ensure that a COP decision on loss and damage comes out from the Glasgow. So that's our hope, and we will continue to work together with our partners to ensure that there's a decision in COP26 on loss and damage. What is the key call to action? Well, everything else that we want to do in terms of addressing climate change, whether it's adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, we need finance and technical assistance. So as Margareta has mentioned, finance is one of the important prerequisites for any of the actions that we want to take in the country and on the ground. So we'll continue to advocate, we'll continue to work with our partners, ensuring that there is adequate and equitable finance available for all the countries, especially those of us who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and so that because we don't have the capacity, we do not have the resources to address all these issues. So we'll continue to depend on our partners. We continue to depend on the financial mechanisms that have been established under the UNFCCC, such as the JEF funds and also Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund. We continue to advocate that there is adequate resources available through those financial mechanisms to help us countries to address all these issues. So in all, loss and damage will continue to be here with us. We'll continue to work with our partners. And we believe that this issue is being addressed at the international forum, such as the Conference of the Parties, because it's already included in the Paris Agreement. It's one of the articles, and it's now one of the thematic pillars of the UNFCCC. So we will continue to work with our partners and through the unitary process, continue to advocate and address this issue in the international fora. So those are my comments, and thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary, for that contribution. I think it was very useful to have that historical perspective, how this issue started back in the 90s, came to a work program at COP19, then COP21, we had the Paris Agreement, Article 8, and then here we are now with this new Santiago network and what that can provide if it's multi-stakeholder, academia, private sector, and others. You also reminded us that loss and damage is here to stay, that the impacts of climate change are going to be around for centuries, regardless of what we do with mitigation and adaptation. Quite a sobering reminder. And we're very much looking forward to what you and the other delegates from Solomon Islands and the Pacific are going to be able to do to get this COP decision in Glasgow on loss and damage. So thank you very much for the work that you're doing and will continue to do. It gives me great pleasure now to call our final speaker, who is joining us from the International Organization for Migration. I'd like to invite Sabira Coelho. She is a program manager at the Fiji office of IOM and has led field research on impacts of climate change on migration in Fiji as well as Madagascar, and has supported policymakers across the globe, Nepal, Fiji, and throughout the UN system. Sabira, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bartlett, distinguished panelists, participants, friends, colleagues. It's really an honor, I think, for me to be here and to join you on this panel. It's also great to be coming in, I think, as the final speaker, because I think in some senses the job has been done already, and I just have to reiterate some of the key points that have been raised. So my intervention this afternoon was to maybe discuss a bit more, I think, perhaps picking up where Ms. Margareta left off, but I was also going to share with you some of the perspectives on climate change and mobility trends in the region, and particularly maybe look at how this is linking into loss and damage and where to from here. And of course, along the way, trying to respond to these three very important questions that have been asked of us. Maybe at the outset also to say that basically what I will share in my interventions actually reflect on the findings from the work that IOM is leading here in the region. It's a program that I manage called the Pacific Climate Change Migration Human Security Program. I'm really glad to see so many of our colleagues and partners online, as well as our colleagues from other field offices. But basically to say that we are working on this program along with colleagues in SCAP, OECHR, ILO, PDD, and PIS. And of course, we're supported by the UN Trust Fund for Human Security, as well as the New Zealand aid program. So in broad, I mean, just to share in a nutshell, just so that this can contextualize a little bit the, I guess, the stories that I will share. The program aims to ensure protection and empowerment of migrants and communities affected by climate change and disasters through three main objective areas. The first is to really look at regional coordination and collaboration and to support Pacific governments and communities to strengthen coordination to address climate-related migration, displacement, and planned relocation through the development of a regional rights-based response. Second, what we aim to do is also look at, supporting migrants and communities to benefit from labor migration as a sustainable development and climate change adaptation strategy. So maybe just mentioning here that, the work that we're doing, it's of course situated within this discussion on loss and damage, but I think it's also maybe important to recognize the outset that movement that's happening in the context of climate change is not necessarily squarely within the context of loss and damage, but could be also looked at as adaptation. And I think this is something that's also been acknowledged within the UNFCCC network negotiations. And the first, I think, reference to migration globally was actually under the Cancun adaptation framework. And I think this is also important to sort of recognize the agency and the resilience of people. The third objective area is to strengthen the evidence base and understanding of good practices related to managing climate-related mobility. And maybe just to say here that one of our activities also includes engaging with the Global Task Force on Displacement that has been established, apologies, under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage that was already just mentioned by the Undersecretary. So till date, under the program, we've conducted a series of consultations, including at the national and regional level, and we've spoken to government, scientific experts, community representatives, many of the colleagues online. I apologize for having to pick your brains so often, but really appreciate, I think, all the inputs that we've received. And I think what we've heard is, and this is again echoing some of the points that were raised already, but of course what we've seen is that climate change, and including within this 1.5 degrees of warming, this will have far-reaching impacts on our region, and it will affect lives and livelihoods and resources. And we know that this will also lead to an increased intensity or frequency of sudden onset hazards. And I think as Professor Viliami mentioned right in the beginning, I think what's equally important is the impact that climate change will have on intensifying the rate of slow onset processes such as coastal erosion and sea level rise. And particularly when we're talking about migration or mobility in the context of climate change, it's more likely that these slow onset processes associated with salinization and coastal erosion will have impacts that are much more, well, we'll see these impacts much faster than say the doom and gloom of sea level rise projections. And what we're already seeing, and I think again, the panelists before me have already elaborated on this, but we are seeing people's homes, assets, farms, livelihoods being destroyed. We are seeing rates of displacement occurring. I think 50,000 people in the Pacific region are displaced every year. And we're also seeing efforts from communities, sometimes spontaneously, but also, of course, through government support, emphasized by Director Vasiti before us, in terms of relocation. And this is occurring, of course, either to avert the worst case scenario of displacement after frequent exposure to hazards, but also in the context of the future risks. And at the same time, we see people moving, more voluntarily, how this can be. And of course, I think one of the things to note is that, this distinction between forced and voluntary movements is really difficult to, to separate what is not a choice. And of course, this is extremely, I think, important when we're talking of loss and damage in the context of compensation and monetary values and all of these points. But basically, we are seeing people moving so-called voluntarily to offset these losses of livelihoods, which may be understood as adaptation. So I guess I must emphasize so that we're seeing all of these movements already, and with our projected climate futures, these drivers of mobility, especially displacement, will definitely be intensified. So there's also this question of not only compensating on the current loss and damage that we experience, but also these future loss and damage and the loss and damage experienced by future generations. I think that's also a key question that comes into mind. So with the permission of my colleagues who are online and also many of I think the partners that we've spoken to, let me share some of the stories. So they're not my personal stories of loss and damage, but maybe I could share some of these as well. So I think through the course of the work, my colleague Jonathan, who's online, has actually led community consultations in the province of Buka and Papua New Guinea, and he's talked about experiences of people moving from the Kachin Islands who have experienced the loss of land to coastal erosion. Our colleagues in Tuvalu have just finished conducting some community consultations in Vaitupu and Funafuti, and they have talked about the migration of people overseas. This is, of course, not happened specifically in the context of climate change, but what we've heard is, stories of loss in terms of traditional skills, knowledge, culture, language. We've heard from our civil society partners historical examples of relocation, for example, in the Bikini Atoll of the Marshall Islands, about the psychosocial impacts of relocation and the sense of a disconnect and loss that's associated when moving from one's land. And maybe to leave you with this one last story from our government colleagues who comes from an atoll in the Federated States of Micronesia. And she shared with us this quote that said, "This is our home. How can we leave those who have gone ahead already resting?" And I think that speaks volumes of why, in a sense, migration as adaptation is also a sensitive issue, and immobility should be sort of promoted as a choice. And everything, all stops need to be put in place to make sure that people can stay where they are and adapt in situ. So there is a uniting thread, I think, across the region. And of course, this reflects very closely to the experiences that have been shared from the Fiji context. And sadly, I think we do expect to see these losses. And this is occurring, of course, not through just the destruction of our physical assets, again, as echoed by speakers before me, but also the loss of these unquantifiable and perhaps a lot more valuable cultural, historical, emotional assets. But at the same time, let's also not forget the gains. Let's also not forget the fact that, as in the Pacific Islands, we aren't victims. There's also resilience. There's also agency. There's also opportunities that migration brings. So I think it's also important to sort of reflect on those questions. So through the course of our work, I think maybe just to also share with you some of the key questions that we've been asked. And these key questions are, how do we protect our current and future generations, given the human rights implications of climate-induced mobility? How do we ensure the right to life, food, water, adequate health, and housing for people that are displaced? For communities that are choosing to migrate, how do we ensure adequate social security, jobs, dignity, absence of discrimination? And then in the absolute worst case scenario, when we're looking at relocation across borders, which infringes, of course, on the rights, the sovereign rights of states and affects the ability of a state to protect its citizens, how can we ensure that the civil and political rights of communities are not infringed upon? And how can we also ensure that continued enjoyment of economic, social, cultural rights? So there's also, I think, important links between the conversations that we're having on loss and damage with the question of, fundamental human rights and, international law that also need to be looked at. Maybe just bringing you, I guess, linking a little bit to the presentation just before by Undersecretary on the global negotiations. So as many of you would know, the Paris Agreement established the task force excuse me, on displacement under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And as such, climate-related mobility, I think in that sense, has been recognized as a sort of a standing item or an issue under that agenda. And there have been recommendations to develop to avert, minimize, and address displacement that have been endorsed in COP 18. And I guess some of the points that I would echo actually reflect on those recommendations. But maybe just before that, to say that these recommendations, again, they're very much aligned with the work at the Human Rights Council, again, which has been led by Pacific states in the forefront, but also in other policy processes and fora, such as the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. So let me just reiterate some of these key recommendations, which I think shed light on the question of acknowledgement and key issues that we need to recognize. So there needs to be continued strengthened coordination, coherence, and collaboration at the national, regional, and of course global levels to address climate-related mobility. There needs to be increased support to national and regional policy processes to formulate laws and policy to integrate these issues and also identify opportunities for durable solutions. Fiji, as I think was already demonstrated, has a wealth and really has a comprehensive set of policies to be able to address this issue. Another point that has also been emphasized by the governments that we've spoken to is that it's extremely important to not divorce the issues of climate-related mobility from the overall development agenda and to make sure that it's not actually being addressed in silos. So that's another critical point to put forward. The other, I guess, recommendation that has been mentioned and to reiterate is that there needs to also be continued collection of data and evidence to understand the risks, but also understand the extent of displacement, the extent of the effect of climate change on people's movement, and also collecting all of this information to be able to inform disaster preparedness. And this brings me to the point on continuing to have strengthened preparedness, early warning, and evacuation planning, but then at the same time also to look at opportunities to facilitate safe, orderly, and regular migration where it is a choice. And I will emphasize that again, that the importance of consent and choice is very critical in this discussion. At the regional level, the Task Force on Displacement recommendations calls for increased support to enhance regional, sub-regional, and transboundary cooperation. And I think this is basically the focus of the program that we are leading, or called the Pacific Climate Change, Migration, Human Security Program. And this is to try and have a shared understanding of these challenges and a collective approach going forward as we support governments to develop a regional response. So just in closing, to tackle, I think, the last question in terms of what we would like Pacific delegations to champion and also perhaps acknowledge, noting, of course, that there's also differences in perspectives amongst the Pacific delegations on this topic. We need to, I think, recognize that the nexus of climate change and displacement, it leads to, of course, economic losses in terms of losses of houses and homes, as mentioned, but also all these extremely important, perhaps more important non-economic losses that have been emphasized. And this necessitates not just immediate solutions, but very long-term solutions through technical and financial support and the development of appropriate frameworks, legal frameworks to be able to address this. So this may take the form, and again, I'm going to give another upvote to funding. I think what we've heard repeatedly is that vertical funds such as the GCF and other, I think, climate funds don't actually provide finance for planned relocation efforts. And if this is something that will have to happen in the region because of the continued exposure to climate change, then there needs to be increased funding in this area. I think a lot of the other points in terms of traditional indigenous knowledge were also reflected. So maybe I can just touch on two other key points to champion. One would be that there is a global mechanism in the form of the Task Force on Displacement, which also has the Pacific as a chair of this task force. And so I would also, we also, I think, would welcome the support to the implementation of its work plan and the extension of its time frame, and more importantly, for them to look less at international solutions, but also come down to the regional level and the national level, particularly in regions such as our own, which is affected, I think, more significantly in comparison to the others. And then finally, the last point would be, I've mentioned it a few times, but just developing appropriate legal and policy frameworks to protect those on the move, and also appropriate implementation and support services. I think there's a lot that has been said in terms of funding, but if we're looking at scenarios where the worst case scenarios, and there needs to also be a backup plan that we will not want to use, but it is something that would need to be put in place. So with that, thank you very much, and back to you, moderator.
Sabir, thank you so much for that presentation. Very interesting ideas about relocation or movement not always being loss and damage, but also potentially considered adaptation, and your very concrete suggestions moving forward. Colleagues, we have now reached the end of the session, and I'm so sorry we didn't have time for question and answer, but there has been a rich dialogue in the chat, which we've captured. We've been talking about in the chat box, climate financing mechanisms. People have been raising indigenous knowledge, talking about domestic action versus international action. So really wonderful things. Look, I think there has been a real shift today in the tone of the conversation about loss and damage. I'm sensing that we're placing this in the context of human rights and in the context of climate justice. And I think there is no doubt in any of our minds that climate change is causing loss and damage to all 30 of our basic human rights. I'm also hearing that loss and damage is no longer politically too complex or difficult, and that this is a lived reality for us in the Pacific and for people around the world, and that therefore there must be meaningful progress at COP26. Just a few very key points that I've heard. It seems that we reject the notion that there should be no compensation for loss and damage, that compensation is essential and it's linked to what we're experiencing now and into the future. We've also heard that there's a call for action on loss and damage at the national level as well as international level, and that means countries including loss and damage in their NDCs and their long-term climate change strategies. We've also heard the need for a loss and damage financing mechanism at the international level, as current financing mechanisms are insufficient or don't provide finance, and that loss and damage should be a part of the global finance goal for climate change from 2025 onward. I think it's clear that Pacific civil society has very strong demands, and we need to keep up the pressure on loss and damage. We need to remain in full solidarity and hold the line on 1.5 degrees. At the end of the day, it's climate change mitigation that is going to prevent loss and damage, and we need to take urgent policy action and urgent financial action to address, avert, and minimize loss and damage here in the Pacific. I sincerely thank all of the panelists and the team behind the scenes from the Pacific Island Climate Action Network. There is a great series of discussions tomorrow. You should see the links coming up shortly in the chat box, and we very much look forward to joining you then. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, and morning to all of you. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much, and stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.